Thanks everybody for joining us, for sticking around for part 2 of this afternoon session. My name is Andrew Kreider. I'm a congressional and intergovernmental liaison here in EPA Region 3. And in my day-to-day work, I see firsthand how EPA partners with all levels of government, tribal nations, other federal agencies, state, county, municipal governments, and metropolitan planning organizations, because together we co-implement all of the public health and environmental programs that benefit our country. So the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, or COG, as they are commonly known, is one such partner. And with us today from COG is Tim Canaan, the Director of Planning, Data, and Research for the National Capital Region Transportation Planning Board, whose home is at COG. Tim has more than 30 years of experience in land use, transportation, environmental planning, research, policy analysis, and he leads a team that's responsible for conducting research, data analysis, and visualizations that help inform regional decision makers on economic, land use, transportation considerations that influence regional travel. And so with that very quick intro, Tim, let me turn it over to you and take it away. Thank you for joining us today.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. I hope everyone can hear me okay. It's great to be with everyone today. Just real quickly, a little bit about the organization that I work for. The Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, or COG as we call it, is an independent nonprofit association. We've been around for a while, since the mid-1950s. We were one of the first COGs in the country to really look at regional issues, metropolitan issues through a regional scale, such as environment, transportation, housing, and things like that. We bring area leaders together to address these issues, and including more than 300 elected officials in 24 local governments in Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. One thing about COG also is that we are also the home of the National Capital Region Transportation Planning Board, or TPB, and that's the region's metropolitan planning organization for transportation planning. And it's in that capacity that I serve. I support the TPB, which prepares the long-range transportation plans for the Washington region. Overall, COG has a little bit more than 100 folks on its staff. The TPB, as I mentioned, is the federally designated metropolitan planning organization for the Washington region. And under that mandate, we have to prepare long-range transportation plans in order for all federal aid funds to flow to the individual state departments of transportation in Maryland, Virginia, the District of Columbia, as well as major transit agencies. And so as part of that, we look at impacts of the plans on different aspects of the community of the region. The most recent transportation plan, Visualize 2045. When we were preparing that for the first time in 2018, after many, many years of preparing these long-range transportation plans, we were for the first time in 2018 required to adhere to the executive order issued a number of years ago to consider the environmental justice effects, and those are the impacts of the plan that might have disproportionately be borne by low income and minority populations. Minority is a term that was used in that federal regulation, but we define that as communities that have higher concentrations of race or ethnic populations. In order to really understand what those impacts might be, we first had to develop a methodology to identify, well, where do these communities exist? And this was in, again, 2018, which was before Justice 40 came about. So we really didn't have a methodology that existed. So we had to develop one on our own. So we developed this methodology to identify census tracts within the region with comparatively higher concentrations of low income and racial and ethnic populations. These census tracts we call equity emphasis areas. Of the more than 1,300 census tracts in the National Capital Region, 364 of them we define as equity emphasis areas. What's interesting about that area is that it's only 12% of the region's land area, but that 12% of the region's land area contains more than about 25% of the total population in the Washington region. So it's about a quarter of the population, which is pretty significant. Just some census data on equity emphasis areas, or EEAs as we often call them. 55% of the low income residents in the region live within equity emphasis areas. 43% are considered Black or African American. 20% Asian, and 43% Hispanic or Latino. These are the census designations that we look at. So those areas in the map that are in orange are designated as equity emphasis areas using the methodology that we developed. So we are now able to map what we believe are communities that may have been historically neglected and may potentially bear a disproportionate impact of proposed plans, policies, and projects in the region. So we sort of set up a system to take a look at that. The methodology that we used to develop the equity emphasis areas really entailed a couple criteria to be met. Criteria one was really looking at income only. Those census tracts that had a low income more than 1.5 times the regional average, and low income, and because low income is often a sliding scale comparison to the income of a household compared to other relative costs in that region, such as housing and other goods and services. What may be low income in the Washington region may very be different than in another area. So low income is defined as a household income less than 1.5 times the federal government's poverty thresholds. For criteria two, we look at census tracts that have very high concentrations of 2 or more racial or ethnic population groups, or also have high concentrations of at least one racial ethnic population group and low income concentration at or above the regional average. So if a census tract meets one of these two criteria, they are designated equity emphasis areas. I won't get into the details of this next slide because it's quite technical, but we really use an index scoring system based on the how big that number might be when we're looking at these individual criteria, and the higher the intensity that one of these criteria might be met, they're assigned a higher index value. So it helps us look at equity emphasis areas or census tracts where not only might they be potentially subject to disproportionate impacts of projects, plans, and policies, but they may also, there may be higher concentrations of populations within those that may experience those impacts. So that's sort of in a nutshell what our methodology is to define our equity emphasis areas. We did that in the absence of Justice 40, but within the last couple of years, there has been this new system called Justice 40 as part of President Biden's Executive Order 14008, tracking climate change at home and abroad. In that executive order, we created the government-wide Justice 40 initiative, which establishes a goal that at least 40% of the benefits of certain federal investments, including many grants that we're talking about in today's conference, flow to disadvantaged communities. And this was a national initiative. And in order to provide assistance with understanding what those disadvantaged communities might be under Justice 40, their methodology has been developed as well by the feds. I'm looking at the U.S. Department of Transportation in particular to help identify what those disadvantaged communities might be under Justice 40. They also look at census tracts like we do for EEAs, but rather than looking at just low income and racial and ethnic populations, other additional criteria are taken into account, such as transportation insecurity, environmental burden, social vulnerability, health vulnerability, risk for climate disaster effects. And then depending on those criteria, the feds, the US DOT has mapped out what would be disadvantaged communities under Justice 40. It looks very similar to the map I showed you before for EEAs that were developed by my organization. So we took a look at the two to see how much do they compare, or do they even compare. And this map really shows, and I apologize, the contrast in colors probably isn't as stark as it could be ideally, but this really maps out the Washington region and shows all the 1,300 plus census tracts. The gray area are those census tracts that are neither EEAs or EJ40 disadvantaged communities. Those that are in the darker blue are census tracts that are only equity emphasis areas under the criteria that were applied by COG. Those that are in the brighter green are both environmental justice disadvantaged, EJ40 disadvantaged communities, as well as COGS EEAs. And those in the darker green are those tracts that are just EJ40 disadvantaged communities. So you can see there's a lot of overlap, a lot of similarity, but there are some differences that are interesting to point out. And the concept is basically the same, where we're really both methodologies are trying to identify communities that have been historically neglected in a lot of decision making and bearing the impacts of a lot of decisions and projects resulting from those decisions. But the criteria applied in each of these cases for EEAs as well as EJ40 disadvantaged communities are a little different, and hence the slight differences in the mapping as well. Getting back to the EEAs, we developed that really in response to that executive order that directed us to consider the impacts very narrowly of our long-range transportation plan on low income and minority populations using the terminology from that regulation. But we also recognize that equity comes in many shapes and sizes and through many lenses. It's a very broad topic, and that is not just about income and race and ethnicity. So we understand that you can also be thinking about equity in terms of unemployment, access to food, access to other types of opportunities. And it has many other applications than really just within the transportation planning sector, which is the sector where I work. But my organization also is very involved in a lot of multi-sectoral activities. We also look at the environment, climate change, air quality, water quality. We look at regional housing. We look at regional public safety, in addition to transportation. So there's a lot of other types of applications that can be used. So we've developed some tools where we can look at different data indicators within equity emphasis areas. And we can use these data to identify where additional housing services or community facilities for transportation may be needed. We can use EEAs for climate planning initiatives, including tree canopy planning, for example. We can use equity emphasis areas as we plan for food security programming and projects that would support that. So we really recognize that there's an opportunity to use this tool that we developed on a much broader basis than just transportation planning. Within the Metropolitan Washington region, equity emphasis areas have been used by some of our member local governments for that, even though this is a tool developed here at COG initially for transportation planning purposes. It has gotten some traction and interest because of its applicability. Montgomery County, Maryland, for example, uses equity emphasis areas to help prioritize projects, and they prioritize projects in EEAs as part of their CIP planning process. They look at areas for prioritizing shoveling sidewalks, for example, and they prioritize sidewalks in equity emphasis areas because there's a strong correlation in equity emphasis areas for people who have difficulty, challenges accessing jobs and employment, and that they're more dependent on public transportation and other types of transportation than their own private automobile. So one of the key ways to get to those transportation services is you have to walk on your sidewalks. So let's prioritize removing the snow on those sidewalks first in order to let those residents access the transportation that they need to get to their jobs, to get to the services that they require. In the city of Frederick, Maryland, equity emphasis areas are using to prioritize projects for park projects within their community. In the District of Columbia, EEAs are being used in citywide planning activities. Our regional transit system, operated by WMATA, has overlaid EEAs with some of its joint development areas to see if there might be some opportunities to prioritize where some joint development projects might take place at some of the Metro rail stations in the future. And even a nonprofit, not just a local government, but a nonprofit, the Greater Washington Community Foundation, has taken our EEAs to identify Black, brown, and other communities of color experiencing home ownership disparities. So you can see that there's a lot of opportunity and potential that you can use with these EEAs in other programs than beyond just transportation planning. Within my own organization, certainly within the transportation planning sector, we do this as part of our planning process, as I mentioned, but we also have a number of grant programs, our Transportation Land Use Connections Program, Transportation Alternatives Set Aside, Regional Roadway Safety, where we actually issue small grants for small projects that help address specific issues in areas throughout the region in order to determine how that funding program gets distributed to these different proposed projects. We have an evaluation criteria system set up, and we recently amended these criteria to include equity emphasis areas, asking if a proposed project is within or within close proximity to an equity emphasis area. And if it does, that project would score higher as part of the scoring process. Certainly our climate, energy, air program, we use EEAs, mapping energy burden of EEAs to assist planning for sustainable energy. And we're also putting EEAs in our mapping activities when we're mapping risk and vulnerability assessments throughout the region. And within the water resources program within my organization, we use the EEAs that we've developed to prioritize distributing tree sampling as part of restoring watersheds. So that's an example of how, in addition to its original purpose that we developed them for, my organization within the context of transportation planning, we've applied them much more broadly throughout many of our programs. We've developed a tool. I'm going to try to demo this tool in just a little bit, but it's an interactive GIS tool that's available. It's outwardly facing, so it's accessible to anybody, and the URL, the link for that, is available at the bottom of the screen there. But users can get onto this tool and map the EEAs throughout the region. Initially, that tool maps just the income and just the race and ethnicity of the census tracts that are EEAs, so you can compare them. However, we've loaded a lot of other data that you can also look at that. But one of the features of this tool is you can actually export the data as an Excel spreadsheet, and then you can attach your own census tract level data into your own analysis and use it for your own. So this data is available for others as well. So fingers crossed, I'm going to try to share this tool and demonstrate it a little bit, and we'll give it a whirl here. So hopefully you see another screen here. That's our main landing page for our equity emphasis areas tool. And there's a little bit of language here on the background of how equity emphasis areas came to be. There's some summary statistics here we provide that shows the total number of tracts in the region and the total number of equity emphasis areas. We do update this from time to time. Every time we update our long-range transportation plan, we rerun the methodology. Using newer census data. We use 5-year estimates from the American Community Survey, which is a product of the United States Census, to use as the basis for the demographic analysis as part of that. So from time to time, you may see some of these numbers change. Some tracts may no longer be equity emphasis areas, or some tracts may become equity emphasis areas. And again, I would caution that if a tract that was an equity emphasis area no longer becomes a tract that's no longer an equity emphasis area, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're addressing equity in that area. There's a lot of other things that could be going on. One of the things I often caution people is that it could be an indicator of gentrification in a neighborhood that was once an equity emphasis area, but for some reason no longer meets those income and race and ethnicity criteria to become considered to be disproportionately high compared to the rest of the region. So you have to be very careful when you're interpreting how an area might change from being an equity emphasis area to no longer being one. This tool also has some summaries comparing household income, gross rent for total persons in the region compared to those in equity emphasis area. You see these other indicators that are here. It just summarizes it in total. And then there's a mapping tool here that you can scroll in and out. Those blue outlines show the equity emphasis areas throughout the region. However, all tracks in the region are shown here, and we're showing those blue ones are shown just so you can see where the equity emphasis areas are. You can even turn on and off some of the subcategories within the legend here if you want to see the intensity of unemployment, for example. In this case, you can click the legend that shows just those tracks where unemployment is greater than 10% using the data that we have. So it's a pretty powerful tool. You can use just the highest two categories to get a better sense of that. And then you can scroll from one indicator to another to see different maps. So it takes a little while to think about it. We also have another tool that was the first one actually, and we still maintain it, and it's accessible through a link at the bottom of this page. And when you click it, it will load this page here, which is our original tool. And here is where you can zoom in. You can click an individual tract. That's an equity emphasis area. You can get some basic data statistics for it. You can also use some of these parts in a legend here, some of these icons to turn certain layers on and off. If you don't want to see the equity emphasis areas themselves, you can turn that off, or you can turn them back on. If you want to map, for example, low-income population throughout the region, you can get a better sense of that. Similar to what I was showing before. But what's interesting about this is that there's a layers widget here at the bottom where you can, that is the widget, but there's also an attribute table widget you can click. And that will bring up all the underlying data of what you're seeing on the screen. And then you can go over to the left here under options, and there's a drop down arrow, and you can export that to a CSV file and then import that into whatever application you might be using for your own analysis for your own tool. So it's something that's available to you. I believe all the presentations will be available after the conference, and the link is in there. But if you simply go to mwcog.org, which is my organization's website, and just put a keyword in for equity emphasis areas, you should be able to get to a page that has that. So I will stop sharing this now, and I will be happy to answer any questions. I have not been able to monitor the chat, so Andrew, maybe you could tell me if there are any burning questions for me to answer at this point.
Yeah, I know. I would encourage people to go ahead and add questions to the chat. There's nothing there at the moment, but I have gotten 2 questions for you offline. People who I think didn't want to ask them themselves. But before I hit you with those questions, I actually just wanted to thank you because I spent some time in the environmental justice program at EPA, and one of the recurring themes that I heard from members of the public with whom we worked was that governments collect this data, but those people want to know how that data is used to implement change to benefit underserved populations who should be better served. And so you had a couple of slides where you talked about how COG was using the EEAs, how some of the member governments like Montgomery County, the District of Columbia, we're looking at program implementation or changes based on that data. So that's great. I mean, I'm heartened to see that, and I do hope that people will look into the tool and look for ways to use it in their day-to-day work or implement similar changes based on the data that they've been able to gather. So thank you. One question I got was you had done a very interesting side-by-side with Justice 40 or EJ 40. And EEAs. And I wonder to what extent in the development of your tool, you looked at or interacted with EJ Screen. That's a sort of planning tool that is commonly known and has been around for a number of years. I'm just curious to know if you've dug into that at all.
We have. I personally have not dug too deeply into that. Some of our technical planners have been using that, and in preparing some of the slides for this, one of my colleagues did use that quite extensively to get in there. And it's very, from what I understand, it's just another way to dig in to get to the data and understand and look at, better understand the criteria that drive that methodology and to do that. So certainly I would encourage people to use that as much as they can. But one of the key differences between EEAs and EJ40 disadvantaged communities, while they are the intent is pretty much the same. EJ40 disadvantaged communities does look at income, it does look at ethnicity and race, but also looks at additional things. And I think that's where the discriminator happens to cause some of these areas to be a little bit different, as well as within the looking at just the income and the race and ethnicity, those two criteria are used for both models. The intensity of both of those criteria might be a little bit different in each one as well. So it's interesting. We're just now trying to get a better handle on understanding EJ40 and to see how that will continue to evolve. Because one of the things that I like about it is that it does consider additional factors than just those income and race and ethnicity, that we felt we had to first, as a baseline, prepare just for ourselves in order to be responsive to those EJ requirements for our long-range transportation plan. So we don't really have a methodology that varies from using just race and ethnicity and income, but once we have it mapped, we can look at those other factors in the map for those EEAs, but actually defining what EEAs are is just those few factors. So I like the kind of broader view that EJ40 disadvantaged communities has, because I think it really acknowledges the how broad of a lens of consideration that equity really is and really should be.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's well put. Thank you. Yeah, I guess the next question that I got was, it builds on what I mentioned earlier. It looks like EEAs have been used by some of the governments in the DC area as they go through different planning processes, transportation related and otherwise. I just wondered if you could comment a little bit further on how extensive the use of EEAs is. I mean, is it being done on an anecdotal basis, or do you really have, based on maybe this national push for a focus on environmental justice and climate justice, do you have other governments who maybe hadn't been engaged picking up now that they've got this tool to help them?
I think it's catching on is probably the way I would characterize this. We started this in really 2017 as we were starting to update our long-range transportation plan, and then we had the plan approved, and we had this methodology vetted with our board members, and we refined it over time, and it simply was the tool we used for doing our EJ analysis for transportation planning. And then not much else happened until the pandemic, until the spring of 2020, the summer 2020, with the George Floyd murders and the protests, and equity, the whole language and awareness of equity as that really started catching on. And so the equity emphasis areas was a product of the Transportation Planning Board work program. It was a transportation specific tool that we had developed. My organization is overseen by a different board of directors, the board of directors of the Council of Governments. And in response to the protests and all the things that we were seeing, regrettably, in the news, our board took a stand and passed a resolution and basically issued a statement on equity, saying that we will consider equity in all the work that we do. And that's a front and center core value of this organization. And as part of that process, really elevated equity emphasis areas and called upon, encouraged our members to consider using equity emphasis areas or a similar tool in the work that they do. And that was appearing in resolutions that we had passed in the fall of 2020 and again in 2021. And as that occurred, I think the elected leaders who sit on our board went back to their respective boards and governing bodies within their local governments and started encouraging their county staffs and city staffs to start taking this on. And slowly we've been seeing this happening over time. As everybody here, as program managers, are painfully aware, it takes a while to make a decision to do something new with a methodology and then incorporate it and make it operational as part of the workflow that you do. So I think right now we're starting to see it catching on more and more. Certainly what I was showing were anecdotal examples of how they're being used. But I think in order for the momentum to be maintained, I don't think that anybody should be taking their foot off the gas in terms of enthusiastically promoting the importance of, if not EEAs at Cogdevelop, but using a tool to understand where your disadvantaged communities are, what makes them disadvantaged in the first place, and how does the fact that they're disadvantaged shut them out of the benefits that they're missing out on, that have historically been overlooked on it, and how do we systematically address that? And the way we do that in the policy realm is using a lot of data-driven analysis. And so this is just one of many tools that you can use to inform that data-driven insights you're trying to achieve. At the same time, as EJ40 disadvantaged communities come out, the screen tool, more and more tools come out, the more the better, I think.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you for that, and thank you for your leadership in the DC region in this area. I think it's going to help a lot of people, like you said, keep their feet on the gas, right?
Yeah.
So I'm checking the chat box. I don't see any questions. Maybe we can give it another minute in case folks have thought of something that like to ask Tim. And then if not, Tim, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap this up?
No, I think hopefully if anybody has any questions, I think my contact information is also on the COG website. So if you do get onto that tool and you have any difficulty, accessing it or have questions about it, feel free to reach out to me, and we'll be happy to help you, make the best use of the tools that we're putting out there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and actually, we did just get one question that came in. That question is, how does an equity emphasis area be removed? Like, how does, I know you touched on this a little bit, maybe explain why it would come off, the list.
So I mentioned that there were a couple criteria we look at, and we look at a census tract, their income, and compare that to the income of the entire region. And if it is above a certain threshold, it is considered to be, if that difference is much higher in one census tract compared to the rest of the region, then it's considered to be an equity emphasis area. Similarly, with race and ethnicity, if the concentration of race and ethnic populations is fairly proportionally higher than the regional average, then that becomes an equity emphasis area. The data that we use to do that is updated over time. The census data, we get updated estimates. So when we rerun that same methodology, the difference between a tract's income and the regional average may change over time. So at one time it may have been much higher low income community that where compared to the rest of the region, it's not. And several factors can happen here. One is nothing may have occurred in the equity emphasis area. What may have occurred is that the entire region might have, the indicator for the entire region may have changed a little bit. That would be unusual, but that is a possibility. Also, just the composition of a community can change over time. And something else that happens too is every 10 years when the census is performed, census tract boundaries may change as well. So in a community, so when you look at a census tract, it's an area, and we may say that it is, let's say it's 25% Asian, but that Asian population may have just been in one corner of that census tract, but it was high enough and concentrated enough for that whole census tract's Asian population to be considered to be 25%. If that tract boundary somehow changed and went right through that very small Asian community, and part of it was distributed to another census tract, that may affect things as well too. And certainly development is something that occurs where new residents, as you build new homes and development occurs, the total population will increase in an area because you built more housing. So the demographic composition of that new population may affect what that average is for that census tract. So there's a lot of different things that can happen that could cause it to no longer be an equity emphasis area. So and that's why I was cautioning earlier, you have to be very careful on concluding whether or not that is a good thing or perhaps a troubling thing when you're looking at that.
Yeah, and I think one element of what you're saying is that every community is different and has specific concerns. And right, I think this is a great tool. It's a great starting point. We just have to keep in mind that everybody's got their own individual community and population challenges that also may shift over time. So, okay, I don't see any further questions in the chat. So I think, Tim, I just want to say thank you again for being part of the summit today. Thank you for introducing this tool to us, sharing with us some of its applications. And folks, thank you all for joining us. And again, as Tim mentioned, this recording will be available at the conclusion of the summit. We appreciate you being here today.
Sure. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.